There is a pattern that American demographic data has been recording for years, but that rarely appears in mainstream news coverage. It is not a political trend. It is not a passing fad. It is a silent, methodical movement, a steady flow of people who ran the numbers, assessed the risks, and decided that certain places no longer offer the minimum conditions to get through what is coming. We are not talking about apocalypse or scenarios engineered to sell fear. We are talking about fragile infrastructure, overburdened systems, accumulated debt, and safety margins eroded over decades until almost nothing remains. When well-established people, with paid-off homes, stable jobs, and deep roots in communities they have known since childhood, start leaving, it is not out of emotional impulse. It is because they perceived something that those who stay have not yet seen, or have not yet been willing to see. Internal migration in the United States is not new. Americans have always moved. From the settlers who pushed westward in the 19th century to the workers who left the South heading north during the 20th, internal movement is part of the country's cultural DNA. But what is happening now has a different quality. It is not the pursuit of opportunity. It is the flight from fragility. And that distinction changes everything about how to interpret the numbers. The United States Census Bureau recorded, between 2020 and 2023, the largest internal migration flows in 4 decades. It is about Americans leaving certain states consistently, year after year, even as the economic narratives of those states remain positive on the surface. When you analyze the states losing population persistently, a pattern emerges with uncomfortable clarity. Places where energy is unstable, water is scarce or too expensive, urban density has eliminated any margin of resilience, and where the cost of simply existing has reached a point where any short-term crisis, a week without power, a more severe winter than normal, can wipe out years of accumulated savings in days. This is not theory. It is in the numbers. And the numbers are pointing at something specific. What this documentary is not must be stated clearly from the beginning. This is not a political argument. The 5 states analyzed here include places with opposing political orientations and completely different histories. Systemic vulnerability does not choose sides. An aging electrical grid does not collapse because the governor is a Democrat or a Republican. An aquifer runs dry regardless of who won the last election. What unites these 5 states is not ideology. It is structure. And structure determines what happens when pressure increases. Let us begin with the state that, more than any other, symbolizes the distance between the image a place projects and the reality its systems reveal when analyzed rigorously: California. For decades, California represented the American ideal of prosperity, innovation, and quality of life. The 8th largest economy in the world, the birthplace of modern technology, a climate that allowed growing practically any food. Beaches, mountains, deserts, and forests within a single state. The California narrative was built with such care and consistency across generations that questioning it still seems, to many, an act of bad faith. But data is not influenced by narratives, and the data from California tells a story that is increasingly difficult to ignore. The state lost more than 700,000 residents in net terms between 2020 and 2022 alone, according to the California Department of Finance, equivalent to a city the size of San Francisco disappearing in 2 years. It is not the poorest who are leaving in the greatest proportion. It is middle-class families, small business owners, skilled workers who concluded that maintaining stability there is no longer viable. They are going largely to Texas, Nevada, Arizona, and Tennessee, destinations that share one critical characteristic: lower dependence on centralized and fragile systems for everyday survival. California is on this list because of structural energy vulnerability. Rolling blackouts are not accidental anomalies. They are official load management policy. The institutionalized admission that the system cannot meet the demand it serves. In August 2020, during a historic heat wave, The California Independent System Operator declared a state of emergency and cut power to millions of homes over multiple consecutive days. Not because infrastructure failed catastrophically, because demand exceeded available supply. That is a fundamental distinction, the difference between an accident and a structural limitation. Accidents can be corrected. Structural limitations need to be rebuilt, and rebuilding takes decades and billions of dollars that are not always available. The California paradox is that the state is simultaneously decommissioning conventional power plants in the name of climate goals while adding millions of electric vehicles to grid demand. Vehicles that need charging at night, exactly when solar generation ceases. This is not an argument against clean energy. It is an observation about the pace of a transition being executed in a way that creates vulnerability in the interval between what has been shut down and what has not yet been built to replace it. That interval can last years, and during those years, the margin remains narrow. Added to the energy fragility, the state faces a water crisis with no simple solution on the horizon. California is responsible for more than 1/3 of all vegetable production and 2/3 of all fruit and nut production in the country, made possible largely by irrigation systems dependent on Sierra Nevada snowpack gradually released into the valleys during summer. As winters produce less snow and what they produce melts faster, this natural supply system breaks down. The Central Valley is literally sinking in some areas due to excessive groundwater pumping, a phenomenon called subsidence, permanently removing geological water storage capacity while damaging canals, roads, and building foundations. The infrastructure was built assuming the permanence of a natural cycle that is now being altered in decades. That assumption no longer holds, and when an assumption embedded in infrastructure fails, the infrastructure eventually fails with it. The people leaving California are not all doing so consciously, not all with this technical vocabulary, but they are doing so with the instinct of someone who ran the numbers and did not like the result. That instinct, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of individual decisions, produces a demographic signal that is now too consistent to dismiss. The second state is Illinois, and specifically Chicago, which concentrates most of the state's demographic dynamics and systemic vulnerabilities. The contrast with California is instructive, because Illinois does not carry California's image of abundance. It carries something different, the weight of infrastructure built for a century that has already passed. Illinois lost population for 8 consecutive years before a marginal stabilization in 2023. The city's water distribution system uses lead pipes that the city government itself publicly acknowledges as a long-term public health problem. Between 400,000 and 800,000 lead service connections remain active in the city and adjacent suburbs. Replacing them is a project the city estimates will take decades and cost billions. Low-level contamination remains a daily reality for millions of residents. Systemic, documented, and without rapid resolution, this is not a future risk. It is a present condition. In February 2021, when a polar vortex of historic magnitude hit the American Midwest, Illinois faced power outages lasting days. Outdoor temperatures dropped to 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, nearly 32 below 0 Celsius. People without electric heating had no functional alternative. This exposed a vulnerability Midwest residents know intellectually, but rarely confront in practice. In an extreme winter without power, an unheated home in Chicago becomes hostile to human survival within hours. Not days. Hours. The 2021 event was a rehearsal, short enough to be managed, long enough to reveal what a more prolonged version would mean for a city with no margin. What makes Illinois particularly concerning is a fiscal reality that rarely appears in migration discussions, but that connects the present to the future in an inexorable way. Pension debt. The state carries a public employee pension liability exceeding $230 billion, for a state with a GDP of just over $900 billion. This structural burden does not disappear with economic growth. It grows with it. In concrete terms, a growing share of the state budget is consumed by obligations of the past, leaving progressively fewer resources for infrastructure maintenance, emergency services, and modernization of critical systems. A state that cannot finance lead pipe replacement, grid modernization, and preventive maintenance while carrying $230 billion in structural debt is not on a trajectory of gradual improvement. It is on a trajectory of managed deterioration. And at some point, management loses control of the deterioration. The people leaving Illinois are saying taxes are too high and crime has increased. But underneath those everyday reasons, what their behavior reveals is a simpler assessment. This place is not getting better. The third state is New York, and the pattern here has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the others. New York is not losing population uniformly. It is losing precisely the layers with the greatest capacity for preparedness and mobility in moments of crisis. Middle and high-income families, small businesses with capital reserves, independent professionals with geographic freedom. The state lost more than 180,000 residents in net terms in 2022 alone. What remains behind when those layers leave is a population progressively less capable of absorbing shocks when systems fail. That shift in composition matters as much as the shift in numbers. New York City is a case study in extreme systemic dependence with no parallel among American metropolises. The city produces practically nothing it consumes. Food, energy, water, fuel, medications, everything arrives from outside through logistical chains that are invisible while functioning, but brutally visible when they stop. That invisibility is itself a risk. Systems people do not see are systems whose vulnerabilities people do not assess. And vulnerabilities not assessed are vulnerabilities not mitigated. Hurricane Sandy, in October 2012, was the clearest unintentional test of that vulnerability in real time. Sandy was a Category 1 hurricane when it made landfall, moderate by any technical standard. What was not moderate was what happened to a city built without seriously accounting for the possibility of flooding at that scale. Parts of Lower Manhattan lost power for a week. The subway flooded and stayed partially out of operation for more than a week. Gas stations ran out of fuel within days, producing lines that lasted hours, and physical confrontations between drivers. Hospitals evacuated ICU patients manually down darkened stairwells. All of this from a storm whose direct impact lasted less than 24 hours. What Sandy revealed is the speed at which cascading failures propagate through a city of extreme dependence. Without power, elevators stop. In a city where most people live above the 10th floor, that means the elderly and mobility limited are effectively trapped. Without elevators, water pressure on upper floors fails. Pressurized water in tall buildings depends on electric pumps. Without water, sanitation stops. Without transit, the city is paralyzed. Without gas stations, those with cars are also immobilized. Each failure triggers the next. The interdependence that makes New York extraordinarily efficient under normal conditions becomes the exact mechanism by which a single disruption amplifies into generalized collapse. The people leaving are not abandoning the city because they dislike it. Most genuinely love it. They are leaving because they calculated the cost of maintaining security when, not if, something more severe than Sandy occurs. And the answer that calculation produced was unacceptable. The fourth state is Oregon, and this one requires a pause because it is the most counterintuitive entry on this list. Oregon has a cultural image that is, in many ways, the opposite of fragility: sustainability, independence, self-sufficiency, connection with nature and land. It is the state where people who care about resilience typically want to be. Which makes the structural reality of Oregon not just surprising, it makes it a warning about the danger of choosing a place based on its image rather than its actual systemic condition. Portland has lost population consistently since 2020, for reasons that include rising costs and deteriorating urban quality of life. But the vulnerabilities that place Oregon on this list have nothing to do with Portland's urban dynamics. They are geological, energetic, and environmental, and they operate on a scale that dwarfs anything the other states on this list face. Oregon sits directly over the Cascadia subduction zone. This is a geological fault extending approximately 1,000 kilometers along the Pacific Northwest coast, capable of producing earthquakes between magnitude 8.0 and 9.2. The intervals between major events on this fault range from 200 to 500 years. The last great Cascadia earthquake occurred in January of 1700, 325 years ago. That places the region inside the historical recurrence window right now, not in the distant future. Now, the Oregon Resilience Plan, an official state planning document, not a preparationist publication, estimates that a magnitude 9, Diriro, Cascadia earthquake would destroy most bridges over the Willamette River in Portland, cut the state's major access roads for weeks, damage or destroy a significant share of coastal housing stock, and leave parts of Oregon without functional infrastructure for months. The document uses the word months repeatedly, not days. Months, and the same document concludes, in its own language, that the state is not prepared for this event. Read that again. Oregon's official emergency planning document concludes that Oregon is not prepared for the event that Oregon's own geology makes statistically likely within this generation. That is not alarmism. That is the government's own assessment of its own readiness. The energy vulnerability compounds the picture. The Pacific Northwest grid depends disproportionately on hydroelectric power from Columbia River dams. In drought years, reservoir levels drop, reducing generation capacity exactly when heating or cooling demand peaks. The 2021 heat dome demonstrated this in real time, temperatures reaching 49 degrees Celsius. In some locations coincided with below-average reservoir levels, pushing the grid to its limit, while a historically temperate city had virtually no air conditioning to fall back on. Portland recorded hundreds of heat-related deaths. Then, the fires. In September 2020, simultaneous wildfires burned more than 1.6 million acres in days, forcing mass evacuations and blanketing Portland in smoke for weeks. Fires cut transmission lines. They contaminate air for months. They permanently destroy communities that do not have the resources to rebuild. Seismic risk, hydroelectric dependence, and intensifying annual fire cycles. Three vulnerabilities that individually would be manageable, but that together reveal a state whose image of resilience is considerably more fragile than it appears from the outside. The fifth and final state is New Jersey, and it closes this analysis in a way that is fitting, because New Jersey does not have dramatic geological faults, or fire seasons or historic water crises. What it has is something more quietly dangerous: density without resilience depth. And density without resilience depth is the condition that, more than any other, defines what it means to be dependent. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the United States, not by a small margin. With more than 1,200 inhabitants per square kilometer on average, every portion of land in New Jersey carries more people than any other state in the country. Under normal conditions, this density is an economic asset. It concentrates talent, commerce, and infrastructure utilization in ways that generate genuine prosperity. But density is only an asset when the systems supporting it function. When those systems break, density does not stay neutral. It multiplies the problem. New Jersey's grid operates in one of the most congested transmission corridors in the country, the corridor connecting mid-Atlantic generation to Northeast consumption. This means New Jersey does not only carry its own systemic fragility, it imports fragility from its neighbors. Failures in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland propagate directly into New Jersey through a network where congestion amplifies rather than isolates disturbances. The state has limited local generation and depends structurally on energy imports. which means that in any scenario of broad regional stress, New Jersey competes for the same available capacity that every neighboring state also urgently needs. Sandy made this visible in ways the state has not forgotten. New Jersey absorbed some of the most severe physical damage of the entire event. Coastal communities were literally swept away. Parts of the state lost power not for days, but for weeks. And the reconstruction process surfaced a reality that decades of coastal development had obscured. Those risk zones were left undeveloped by previous generations for a reason. The reason did not disappear. The development simply built over it. The houses are there, the people are there, and the storms will come back. Under conditions of rupture, a prolonged blackout, a severe weather event, a supply chain failure, the density that generates efficiency inverts and becomes a multiplier of vulnerability. Many people competing for scarce resources. Interdependent systems where one failure triggers the next. Safety margins removed in the name of efficiency. No physical space for any local production of food, water, or energy to buffer the failure of centralized systems. The people leaving for Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee are not leaving for the weather or the scenery. They are leaving because they sense, with or without the technical vocabulary to name it, that the margin between normal and collapse has become dangerously thin. What connects these 5 states is not political identity, not culture, not the ideological divisions that dominate the headlines covering American migration. What connects them is structural. They are places where the relationship between what their systems promise and what those systems can sustain under pressure has become too narrow for people paying attention to comfortably accept. Fragility accumulated quietly in aging pipes, in pension obligations, in grids running at capacity limits, in densities that outpaced resilience, in geological exposures that were always there but never had to be faced. The light turns on. The water runs. The supermarket is stocked. Everything appears to function. But the margin between that apparent functioning and actual collapse has narrowed. Not dramatically, not all at once, not in any way visible to those not specifically measuring it. It narrowed incrementally over years, in ways that only become obvious in retrospect, after the event that finally exposed what was always underneath. The movement this documentary analyzes is not panic. Panic is reactive, emotional, and disordered. What the data reveals is the opposite. Methodical, gradual, and deliberate. People who reached conclusions and whose behaviors express those conclusions more clearly than their words ever would. They are not announcing that something is wrong. They are simply no longer there. What this documentary does not say is where to go. That depends on variables no general analysis can resolve. Individual constraints, family commitments, financial realities, and priorities that differ from person to person. What this documentary says is what to look for, regardless of where you are or where you are considering being. Observe the relationship between energy generation and consumption in your region. Not the official statements, but what the historical failure record actually reveals about real resilience. Observe where your water originates and which systems keep it in motion. Observe the density around you and what happens to it when those systems stop for 72 hours. Where does food go? Where does waste go? How do people move? What happens to pressure on resources that suddenly become scarce? Observe the structural debt of local and state governments and what it reveals about their realistic capacity to maintain and invest in infrastructure over the next 10 years. Observe the history of extreme events in your region, and more than anything else, the speed and completeness of recovery after each one. Because recovery reveals real resilience more accurately than any preparedness declaration ever could. These are not metrics of paranoia. They are not the vocabulary of fear. They are the questions that any person reasoning clearly should ask about the place where they live and plan to continue living. Questions that the comfort of daily normality makes easy to defer, because while everything functions, there is no apparent urgency. The urgency only becomes apparent when it is no longer deferred. And by then, the options available are no longer the same. The people silently leaving these 5 states are not reacting to headlines. They are not following political narratives. They are executing a quiet, personal analysis of trajectory and acting on its conclusions while they still have the freedom and the time to do so deliberately. There is a fundamental difference between acting from rational anticipation and reacting from desperate urgency. One of those positions preserves options. The other inherits whatever remains. The movement has already begun. The question each person needs to answer for themselves is not whether the movement is real. The data has already answered that. The question is whether they are paying attention to it, and if they are, what they are choosing to do with what they see.